I'm Graham Allison, Director of the Center for Science and International Affairs and former Dean of the school. On behalf of Harvard University, I want to welcome you tonight to the forum of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and it's a special privilege for me to welcome our honored guest, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Boutros Boutros-Ghali, and Mrs. Ghali. Boutros-Ghali, so please. This is, as you might notice, a full house. Kathy tells me there's 500 or more people set into other rooms where they're watching this on video, and some more people outside. And I think that's a testimony of the enthusiasm of the Harvard community for the honor that the Secretary General does us tonight in being here. I think for any of us who read the newspapers, we notice that the Secretary General of the United Nations has one of the most challenging jobs in the world. He's the only individual on the globe whose official responsibilities encompass the 5.5 billion people in over 185 countries that try to share the planet. On the other hand, as the Secretary General frequently points out, the United Nations is only the instrument of its sovereign member states. Without these states' support and money and troops and political will, he cannot hope to act effectively. And it's no secret that support by those governments, including, for example, the U.S. government from time to time, is frequently much less than he would desire or deserve. Here at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, we take pride in having students from more than 75 countries who contribute immeasurably to the education of their fellow students, and to many of us here in the faculty, I'll testify, as they are preparing themselves for leadership roles back in their host nations or in international diplomacy. So Dr. Boutros-Ghali's career offers us many insights about the complex interactions between the world of ideas and the world of power. Born in Cairo in 1922, Mr. Boutros-Ghali was educated initially at Cairo University and received his PhD in international law from Paris University. Author of 30 books and more than 100 articles on subjects ranging from international law and international affairs to more esoteric aspects of political science, which was his interest at one stage. He has a long-standing interest particularly in regional organizations and regional cooperation, which happened to have been the topic of his PhD thesis. For 3 decades, he served as a professor of international law and international relations at Cairo University, and won international notice as a distinguished jurist. Dr. Boutros-Ghali is also one of the world's most experienced practitioners of international diplomacy. He was Egypt's foreign minister from 1977 until his appointment as Secretary General in 1991. And as foreign minister of Egypt, he played an active role in the Mideast peace process and was credited by President Carter, for example, as having been critical to the success of the Camp David agreements. December of 1991 was a defining moment for the United Nations. With the end of the Cold War that had paralyzed the Security Council, it became possible to imagine that the UN might return to its original aspirations and ambitions. And in that context, the international community turned to Boutros Boutros-Ghali and appointed him for a 5-year term as Secretary General. The Security Council asked him to prepare an analysis and recommendation on ways of strengthening the capacity of the United Nations for preventive diplomacy, peacemaking, and peacekeeping. And that mandate then has led to a series of reports by the Secretary General, including an agenda for peace, an agenda for development, and an ongoing effort to produce an agenda for democratization, about which he and I were discussing or having a little discussion earlier. In these reports, he's laid out an intellectual framework for the central challenges of the international community in this period. And in each of these reports and in his many other activities, his agendas for action touch issues of great interest to the faculty and students and community here at Harvard. As a man both of thought and of action, he provides for us a living case study of issues right at the heart of a mission of a school of government. It's thus with real appreciation and anticipation that we welcome him here tonight and look forward to his remarks on an issue of vital importance, an issue that's been right at the top of the agenda of our Center for Science and International Affairs here at the school, stemming the tide of international terrorism. So, Dr. Butruscawi.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, terrorism has touched my life. My grandfather, who was Prime Minister of Egypt, was assassinated by terrorists. I was with President Anwar Sadat on his historical trip to Jerusalem, to Camp David, and at the signing of the Treaty of Peace between Egypt and Israel. For these achievements, President Sadat was assassinated by terrorists, and I have to live with this threat. In recent years, my homeland, Egypt, has been the target of terrorists. They seek to intimidate the population. They seek to destroy the tourist industry. They care nothing for the innocent lives they destroy. Terrorism is not new. Acts of terror are as old as history itself. But terrorism in our time has grown from a national to an international to a global threat. Terrorism in Sarajevo in 1914 sparked the First World War. In the 1970s, the expansion of international air travel became the victim of terrorist hijackers. In the Cold War years, terrorists were primarily motivated by ideology. They carried out terror in order to claim credit and gain attention to their cause. Today, terrorists motivated by religious extremism may care nothing for publicity. Their silence makes them all the more difficult to locate. Ours is an age of increasing globalization, but also of increasing fragmentation. Both of these forces favor the terrorists. Fragmentation disrupts social solidarity and drives groups into ever deeper opposition to civilization. Globalization reduces the capacities of governments to maintain order. The communications revolution, the private global economy, and the increasingly borderless world we live in provide conditions which terrorists can exploit. Terrorism, therefore, has become a global danger. Terrorists thrive on the condition of globalization, but are not bound by international restraints. No region, state, people, nor person is immune for terrorism, because terrorists have become international actors. Terrorists have international networks of alliances, communication and funding, They receive training, instructions, and arms from abroad, and terrorists take refuge abroad after committing their crime. Terrorists have become skillful at escaping through the cracks in the international system. Terrorist activity has increased because terrorism has successfully adapted to globalization, while anti-terrorism remains provincial and national. Unilateral and even bilateral action is not sufficient to deal with a threat that is global. International cooperation and coordination is crucial. International restraints on terrorists must be implemented. A global approach is needed. Because of recent events, nations are recognizing the importance of a global approach to defeat terrorism. In his address at the opening of the 51st session of the General Assembly last month, President Clinton showed leadership in asking all nations to commit to zero tolerance for terrorism and called on all states to ratify all 11 international conventions against terrorism. At the summit of the peacemakers in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt on March 1996, I joined world leaders in asserting the importance of bilateral, regional, and international cooperation and enhanced coordination to stop acts of terrorism. A few months later, the Declaration on Terrorism of the G7 Summit in Lyon, in France, on June 27, 1996, declared the intent of the parties to enhance the capacity of the international community to defeat terrorism. These are promising developments. As international cooperation and coordination are precursors to a global approach, these initiatives not only demonstrate the international community's commitment to take action, but to take this action on a global scale. Toward this end, the General Assembly of the UN has assumed a pioneering role in the global fight against terrorism by adopting the Declaration on Measures to Eliminate International Terrorism on December 1994, which was reaffirmed last year by the General Assembly Resolution 5053. The General Assembly's commitment to defeat terrorism was reaffirmed in the declaration on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations in October last year, which stressed the importance of international cooperation to defeat terrorism. Aiming to consolidate this progress, I submitted a report to the 50th session of the General Assembly containing proposals on modalities for the implementation of the tasks entrusted to me under the Declaration on Measures to Eliminate International Terrorism. This report also included information on the status of relevant multilateral conventions and an update by member states on the progress of their efforts against international terrorism. On March 28, 29, 1996, I sent my senior aides to contribute to the working group meeting of Sharm el-Sheikh summit participants. The participants at this meeting, taking place in Washington, D.C., prepared recommendations on how best to implement the summit's decisions. All these steps demonstrate a greater international awareness of the importance of combating terrorism through cooperative and effective common action. But even more fundamental basis exists for international action against terrorism. Over the recent decades, a body of international legal instruments has been put in place by the United Nations. Taken together, they provide an increasingly strong foundation for success in the struggle against terrorism. These instruments have grown to become a crucial factor in the anti-terrorist fight. At present, 11 international conventions that address crimes associated with terrorism have been deposited with the Secretary General of the United Nations. Each deals with a specific part of the fight to stop terrorism. There is an international convention to stop terrorism against embassies, diplomats, and other internationally protected persons. This convention is in force with 91 ratifications. There is an international convention against hostage-taking. This convention is in force with 77 ratifications. A convention of the safety of the United Nations personnel. This convention is not yet in force. Only 9 states have done the ratification of this convention, and the convention needs 22 ratifications to be in force. There is a convention against offenses committed on board aircraft, and this convention is in force with 156 ratifications. There is a convention against unlawful seizure of aircraft, and this convention is in force with 156 ratifications. There is a convention against acts that endanger civil aviation, a convention to suppress acts of violence at airports, a convention to physically protect nuclear material, a convention to suppress acts against maritime navigation, a convention to protect offshore drilling and research platforms, and a convention on detecting plastic explosive, and this convention is not yet in force with 23 ratifications, because we need 25 ratifications are required. All these are international legal instruments facilitated by the United Nations. They are available and essential for the fight against terrorism. In addition, there are important regional agreements adopted by the Organization of American States, by Europe, by South Asia, and that can be of particular importance in dealing with ideological, ethnic, and narcotics-related acts of terrorism. I have provided this current session of the General Assembly with a comprehensive review of the status of all international conventions related to terrorism. And I am preparing a plan of action to encourage all member states to sign or ratify the conventions and recommendations on intergovernmental mechanism necessary to help member states implement the convention and ensure compliance with them. In the future, the task is threefold. First, we must take the normative foundation provided by these international instruments as a platform for immediate global action to counter terrorism. Second, we must rally the political will to overcome the difficulty of international cooperation and coordination. And third, we must proceed to widen the network of legally binding international conventions to address the key counter-terrorist subjects not covered by the instruments, including bombings, fundraising, traffic in arms, technical cooperation in training for counterterrorism, exchange of information on suspects, and preventive use of weapons of mass destruction by terrorists. Although these initiatives will contribute to the fight against terrorism, without new machinery to monitor and ensure implementation, the effect of any legal instrument is marginalized. As we look at the road ahead, we need to recognize four major difficulties that must be addressed. First of all, some governments resist or hesitate to cooperate against international terrorism for reasons of their national security, fearing that they themselves will be targeted. They make quiet or tacit arrangements to leave terrorists alone in return for being left alone. Second, anti-terrorist action can sometimes violate the human rights of innocent people, and sometimes government authorities may deprive their people of human rights under cover of a claimed necessity to take anti-terrorist precautions. Third are technical impediments to cooperation against international terrorism. The different laws of different states can result in terrorists obtaining refuge status or safe havens in some countries. They can make extradition difficult or even impossible when one country permits capital punishment and the other does not, and they can prevent intelligence sharing on grounds of national security or sovereignty. And four, we need to be clear about the difference between fighting organized crime and fighting terrorism. It is easier to get cooperation against crime because issues of state sovereignty or regime continuity are rarely involved. The methods of stopping transnational crime are in many cases not the same as those needed to stop terrorism. Yet sometimes it is a fact that terrorists who seek political power or religious objectives rather than wealth will cooperate and conspire with organized crime in order to finance their terrorist operations. These facts create confusion and complexity. We must be clear about them as we move toward improved anti-terrorist mechanism for the future. This we must do, for the time has come for the international community to work toward the achievement of a general international instrument of a binding nature against terrorism. For lack of international agreement on the legal framework for the fight against international terrorism, the approach adopted so far have been sectorial and partial. Existing instruments have targeted specific terrorist acts using specific means of transport against specific categories of persons and by means of specific substances or devices. However, in the light of the General Assembly Declaration on measures to eliminate international terrorism, it has become possible to tackle the question of international terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, in all its specificities, and no matter what reason may be invoked as justification. My call today for a general international anti-terrorist instrument is therefore a call for a comprehensive legal framework for the fight against international terrorism in all its aspects. The United Nations is an indispensable focal point for bringing about this global approach. As shown by anti-terrorism initiatives in the last few years, the United Nations has the global mandate and membership to facilitate global consensus building and mobilize global action against terrorism, as we have mobilized global consensus against chemical or biological weapons. It is through policy debated at the UN, through decisions taken at the General Assembly, that states can find the instruments to combat terrorism as a global threat. Indeed, the adoption of the 1994 Declaration on Measures to Eliminate International Terrorism by the General Assembly demonstrated that the UN was the only forum in which all countries have worked together to fight international terrorism. The UN, being the center of international cooperation to promote and protect human rights, can best ensure that the anti-terrorist struggle is not pursued at the expense of human rights. This difficult synthesis is a central problem which deserves all our attention. The past has provided us with a legal foundation. The present affirms the need to consolidate and act on that foundation. The future calls for a global approach to strengthen and extend that foundation. The United Nations has been a pioneer in the past. It is a proponent in the present, and it stands ready both to lead and to serve this collective effort. Thank you. I have not mentioned in this presentation some important topics like state-sponsored terrorism, like strategies adopted by states in their struggle against terrorism. And I will be happy to answer questions on these and other topics related to international terrorism. And I used to say, don't hesitate to ask non-diplomatic questions, and I promise non-diplomatic answers.
Thank you. With that invitation, let me remind you of the ground rules. There are microphones here at the two sides on the floor and in the balcony. If you'll line up at the microphones, Harvard students should have initial preference. Please identify yourself, and questions are short and usually end with a question mark. So please.
My name is Rami Tadros. I'm an undergraduate here at the Harvard College. Your Excellency, while I totally agree with what you said about the need for a more global approach to terrorism, I would like to allow me if you take issue with your narrow definition of terrorism and make a further point about what you mentioned about state-sponsored terrorism. You seem to adopt a narrow yet rather pragmatic approach to the usage of this term. Allow me to mention a few more examples of terrorism from the Middle East and nearby to the Middle East. There is the Iraqi systematic terrorizing of the Kuwaiti population by the Iraqi forces during the Gulf War, the systematic bombing of southern Lebanon by Israeli Air Force recently, and closer to Europe is the systematic terrorization of the Muslim populations in Bosnia. And I would like to hear what your thoughts about such acts of state-sponsored terrorism. does the word terrorism in the ugly word of terrorism in certain instances be transformed to the more politically correct word of collateral damage?
You mentioned certain cases. In fact, our definition of terrorism is limited to terrorism in a period of peace. In other words, if there is a military confrontation between two countries, then it is a situation of war. And in a situation of war, terrorism will be related to the humanitarian law. So our definition of terrorism, that you have a country which is in a state of peace, and we have a group or another country who are encouraging a group to do act of terrorism. So we are not talking about terrorism in a situation of war between two countries. There are different law and different regulation.
Please, here at the right.
My name is Benjamin Krefitz. I'm in the undergraduate college. And I was wondering, along the line of countries that harbor terrorists, in particular Libya with the Pan Am bombers, how we can get them to give up those terrorists peacefully without having to deal with an invasion or anything.
This is the case of terrorism sponsored by a member state, and here the Security Council have adopted a resolution which are sanctions against Libya. The end of this resolution, they have asked the Secretary General to negotiate with the Libyan government to obtain certain results. We have obtained one result was there are in fact three main actors. The Lockheed Bird, which is the United States. You have a plane belong to a French company, and then we have arms which was sent to IRE in Ireland by Libya. In other words, it is a case where they are encouraging terrorists in another country. So I was able to solve in a certain way the first problem, which is that they have given all the information about how they was distributing the arms, where are the factories of arms, and this is closed. Then we still have to solve the two other problems, which is the plane, the French plane, which was destroyed, and then the Lockheed Bird, which was destroyed in Ireland. And we are negotiating with the government, until now without success, but the decisions are taken by the Security Council, and the Security Council every 3 months decided to maintain the sanction until they will fulfill the resolution which have been adopted by the Security Council. We have another case, which is the assassination, a tentative of assassination by terrorists of President Mubarak of Egypt 2 years ago in Addis Ababa, and terrorist movements in the countries around. Here there is another resolution which has been adopted, and just a few days ago I sent a special representative to negotiate with the government of Khartoum to obtain from them the implementation of the resolution which was adopted by the Security Council. So in the case of terrorism sponsored by state, directly or indirectly, in certain cases, the Security Council have adopted a sanction. So this is a way which has been done where the United Nations are using force. But it is not an easy operation, because you may have the opposition of certain member states who say we are intervening in the internal affairs of a member state. You can have the opposition saying the proof is not easy to offer the proof that there was a state-sponsored terrorist. How can you prove that the government was involved and that it was not a kind of group inside the state without even the knowledge of the state, which happened very often? So it is not an easy operation, and it needs, again, the approval of the member of the Security Council. And I will just say to add that sanction, I want to add that sanction against a government, in fact, it is the poorest of the population who are suffering from the sanctions, and not the government which is guilty of sponsoring terrorism. So the establishments, the government itself, don't suffer of the sanction. It is the population and the marginalized group of the population who are suffering from the international sanctions.
Up in the right balcony, you can see here, please.
My name is Joanne Fan. I'm first year at Kennedy School. Recently, the United Nations had suffered financial crisis due to membership due arrearage. There are many fundraising campaigns around the world to save the UN from bankruptcy. Most notably, the U.S. Citizens Campaign, sponsored by UNA USA, the World Federalist, and the like, has been very successful. In addition, more than 44,000 citizens from Taiwan also donated $4 each and signed petition letters in support of Taiwan. They have presented the donation in the International Press Conference during the General Assembly opening in September. Would you please comment on how the UN will receive this money?
What is the relation with this question with international terrorism? However, my answer is that there is a resolution which was adopted 25 years ago by the General Assembly recognizing only one China, and thus the position of the United Nations is non-recognition of Taiwan, and we cannot accept any kind of assistance or any kind of intervention from Taiwan which may be considered like an indirect recognition of Taiwan.
Even for private funds?
But what?
Even for private funds from private citizens?
No, if it is a private fund, the United Nations is not allowed to receive private funds. There is different other institutions which we must receive the funds from member states.
Here at the left balcony, please.
My name is Daniel Conway. Sir, while the measures you outlined for combating terrorism from a multilateral approach would be helpful perhaps against state-sponsored terrorism, do you not think that a unilateral approach by an individual state would be more useful in combating the religious ideologue who is willing to give up his life for his cause?
Again, you will have a problem. If you have a unilateral action, this unilateral action may be considered incompatible with the Charter of the United Nations, because according to the Charter of the United Nations, you are not allowed to use force in international relations unless it is with the amended from the Security Council. This is the first problem, which is a legal difficulty. But you have a practical difficulty that this may be the beginning of a kind of confrontation, because an intervention of one state to stop terrorism in another state may provoke a reaction and may provoke a kind of confrontation between two member states. But in many cases, member states have use anti-terrorism action to contain terrorism on a bilateral relation. But again, this is a particular case of bilateral relation between two states. It have not the international dimension that the terrorists are moving in different parts of the world, that the terrorism received assistance from different parts of the world, that the terrorists can find refuge in different parts of the world, that there is an international network, and this is what I call by international terrorism, and that the reaction or the anti-terrorist policy is still limited on the bilateral basis. So we may be able to solve certain problem of terrorism by the bilateral action, but unless we will have a real solidarity to have a collective approach to terrorism, we will not be able to solve international terrorism. Because there is a real international network of terrorism helping each other at international level, at a global level. They have the money in a bank somewhere in an island, and then they receive the arms from a second countries. They will receive refuge. They will find refuge in a third countries, and they will attack another country. So this is, I was paying attention to this in this presentation, to the international terrorism, the international dimension of terrorism.
Please.
Thank you, Dr. Boutrous-Scalia. My name is Devrati Ghosh. I'm an undergraduate at the college and also a member of the Harvard International Relations Council, and thank you very much for coming. My question actually does go back to the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 and the UN's response, specifically through the International Court of Justice. On its docket, the International Court of Justice had a contentious case between Libya and the United States, where Libya brought a case claiming that the U.S. was trying to force the extradition of the two suspects in the case. Now, involved in that case will be the issue of the legality of the Security Council resolutions imposing the very sanctions that were designed to force the extradition of the suspects. So I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on how the role of the International Court of Justice, or what the role of the International Court of Justice is in this issue, and
according to the Charter, the International Court of Justice is an organ of the United Nations, and the decision of the Security Council prevail on all the other decisions.
Thank you. My name is Carlos Diaz. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, first year. And my question doesn't relate to terrorism as we have defined it, but inspired by Professor Allison's comment during his introductory remarks about your agenda for democratization. I think I wanted to take this opportunity to ask you what you think the role of the United Nations should be in promoting democratization in Cuba, and in ending what many would say it's not terrorism, but it's a form of terror in oppressing the Cuban people and preventing dissent towards the government.
I have not understand your question. Can you repeat it?
What do you think the United Nations should do, or is willing to do, to promote the democratization in Cuba? A peaceful transition.
We, according to Article 2, Paragraph 7, we are not allowed to intervene in the internal affairs of the member states. And when we are talking about democratization, we are offering the assistance of the United States, of the United Nations, if a member state by the way, this is a classic mistake which is done by many representatives of the member state at the United Nations. So we are ready to offer our assistance in the field of democratization, which is new because this is possible only since the end of the Cold War, only if we are asked by member states. We cannot impose on a member state any intervention. We must receive the demand for electoral assistance. They must accept even the number of observers which we will send. We have to conclude an agreement with the member state how they will operate. So we are restricted by the sovereignty of the member state and by the Article 2, Paragraph 7, which don't allow us to intervene in the internal affairs unless we are asked by a member state.
Please.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General, and thank you for addressing us here tonight. My name is John Fernandez, and I'm a Kennedy School student here from the non-self-governing territory of Guam. While surely this is a decade filled with widespread terrorism, it is also the UN declared decade of indigenous people's rights, and it's about this issue which I have a question. Earlier this week in Geneva, representatives of the indigenous people unanimously walked out of a United Nations working group on the draft declaration on the rights of indigenous people. The charge is that states are attempting to amend the draft to dilute and undermine the declaration and the inherent right of these groups to self-determination, and are doing so without consultation and consent of the indigenous people. This is characteristic of the same set of colonial attitudes with which these states, one of which is the U.S., continues to view indigenous people. And sir, the United Nations has been the champion of indigenous people's rights for over half a century. So my question to you is, what will you do in your capacity as Secretary General to protect the special status of indigenous peoples consistent with the principles of the UN Charter? And how do you plan to ensure the direct involvement and participation of indigenous peoples in preserving their right to be free from colonialism and to determine their own destinies in the 21st century?
We have 2 years ago the Year of the Indigenous People. We have a special session. We have long discussion. I have received representatives of the indigenous people in Canada, in the United States, in Brazil. And you are asking a very specific question, the right of self-determination. what are the limits of the right of self-determination. Is, let us state, a group of people in a country allowed to ask the right of self-determination? It depends on the constitution of this country. And each constitution changes. Certain constitutions say that the member state of the federal union are allowed, this is the last constitution in Ethiopia, are allowed the right of secession. In other words, are allowed to have the right of self-determination. But if the constitution don't allow this, we can do nothing. We can just defend certain general principle. We can very quietly talk to the governments, mentioning the problem of indigenous people, but practically we are not allowed. There is different conventions which have been adopted by the ILO more than 40, 50 years ago about the indigenous population. But it means we are dealing with sovereign states. And if the sovereign state just will reply, this is not your business, this is the business of our government, we can say nothing, it means.
Thank you.
This gentleman.
I'm Joan Saldana, a student here at Graduate School of Arts and Sciences from East Timor. I would like to take some of your minutes just to address the question of East Timor. I really appreciate your efforts in holding this all-inclusive inter-East Timorese dialogue, which I also part of the group from inside. And I would like to know what is it possible your office can push through negotiation between Portugal and Indonesia, and also with the participation of East Timorese in the conflict? What is the specific effort that your office may do?
I have had personally 8 meetings during the last 5 years, twice a year, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Portugal. And the discussion was about East Timor. The last meeting was in June in Geneva, and the next meeting will be held the 18th of December in New York. So I'm trying to do my best to encourage the two ministers to discuss what are the different possibilities. But let us talk very frankly, the positions are completely different. So what we have done is to encourage inter-Timorese talks between the people of Timor, East Timor, who are in favor of the integration in Indonesia and those who are in favor of independence. We have been able to hold 2 meetings in Austria, and we are discussing again the possibility of having a 3rd meeting. Those meetings will not discuss the substance, which is the future of East Timor. Those meetings will be limited to how we can build confidence between the 2 groups of Timorese, those who are in favor of integration and those who are in favor of independence. So it is a long process, and we are continuing to negotiate it, and as long as the negotiation is going on, let us hope that we can find a solution which will take in consideration the point of view of Portugal and the point of view of Indonesia, and in the same times the point of view of the population of East Timor.
Please.
Good evening, Mr. Boutros. My name is Rami Adib, and I'm an Egyptian Copт. And I actually have 2 points, but 2 little ones. The first one is you made a very good point concerning how the governments should combat terrorism, but without violating human rights. However, it have been the case, like especially in Egypt, where the government's procedures to avoid terrorism and to combat terrorism were seen or viewed by international organizations and human rights international organizations like Amnesty International and other ones which is supported by the United Nations as violating the human rights. So the Egyptian government was doing what can be described as combating the terrorism, while other international organizations were saying that this is violating to the human rights. So how can we draw the distinction between combating terrorism without really violating the basic need of people to express their opinions or themselves? The second point, sorry, it's not a question actually. You have been bombarded with questions for almost an hour, so I just wanted to say 5 years ago you were appointed as Secretary General, and many people underestimated what you can do for the United Nations. But I think after 5 years you proved that you have done a lot, and you have done lots of reconstruction in the body of the United Nations and in the international level. So thank you for all what you have done.
Thank you. I believe that I mentioned in my presentation that one of the most difficult problems is how to avoid that anti-terrorism measures could be taken at the expense of the protection of human rights. And this is the real problem. It means if you want to take real measures to stop terrorism, you may adopt measures which are anti-democratic, and this may be at the expense of human rights. So here it is a very delicate problem, how to maintain a kind of equilibrium between basic liberties, between protection of human rights, and measures which have to be taken to fight terrorism. And this is the reason why you find that many terrorists find refuge in the Scandinavian countries, and the basis of this that they are political refugees. They say we are there because we are a policy which is different. And they have committed crimes, but they are not, they are protected. So this is the fact that we have different legislation. And as I mentioned, one of the real problems in fighting terrorism is how to maintain this equilibrium between democracy, protection of human rights on one side, and the exceptional measures which have to be taken to fight international terrorism.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Mona Fawaz. I'm a graduate student at MIT. I would like to have a clearer definition of what terrorism is. When you say that in cases of war, violence is not terrorism, then we really have to maybe redefine what war and peace is, especially like in the case of Lebanon or Palestine, movements such as the terrorist resistance, such as Hezbollah, are not terrorists then. Or again, Hamas and its acts are, especially that Palestine and Israel are not really in peace, are again not terrorists.
I'm not saying they're not against terrorism. I'm just having a legal approach by saying that there is a difference between the international law in time of peace and international law in time of war. And that terrorism in time of war will have different regulation than terrorism in time of peace. The humanitarian law which have been adopted by the different conference on humanitarian law are trying to protect the civil population of terrorism in time of war.
But you would still define it as terrorism.
Yes, but I will just say it is different because we are in a situation of war.
So why wouldn't you define the other side, which is like the first question was mentioned, when there's a bombing on civilians, as terrorism too?
But we are in a situation of war. It means they are using force. They are using force through military. They are not allowed to use force against civilian, but they are using force against civilian. It happened during all the last war, unfortunately. So they are not respected the law, international law of war, or what we call the humanitarian law. But I want to say that terrorism is there in the two cases, but it has a different specificity, different dimension, where we are in a state of confrontation between two states, where they are killing each other, and terrorism in a situation of peace.
Please, in the balcony.
Hello, my name is Jeannie Lang from New York, and I'm a student at the college. The chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations particularly criticized the European powers, the United States included, for their complacency in the Bosnia situation, saying that they essentially waited for the United Nations to take action. And at the height of the Sarajevo bombing in '92, you said that you could think of 10 other situations in the world where the people were in greater need of help. While that may be true from the viewpoint of the international perspective of the United Nations, for the European powers, of course, this was an immediate crisis. I was wondering to what degree you think your philosophy of UN empowerment is encouraging complacency on the part of nations which may have a particular interest in situations or immediate crises.
It was in Sarajevo what I was trying to explain to the people of Sarajevo who were suffering and were in a very desperate situation, that they have other situations where we have what I call orphan conflicts. conflict where the international community don't pay attention to the conflict. And they are alone, they are lonely. And the conflict going on. You have a terrible conflict in Afghanistan, and nobody there, and nobody is paying attention to this conflict. You have a horrible conflict. You have 500,000 people have been killed in a genocide in Rwanda, and nobody pay attention to this conflict. So what I was trying to explain to the people of Sarajevo, maybe I was misunderstood, and maybe it was not a nice response, that look, your situation is less difficult than in other, because the international community is there. The United Nations is there. The Blue Helmet are there. We are trying to help you. But you have many other cases where nobody take care of them, where there are really orphan conflicts, where nobody pay attention to them, where we are not even able to obtain money to offer humanitarian assistance. I have tried to collect money for Afghanistan. It was $80 million. We just obtained $20 million. They don't pay attention to Afghanistan, the international community. Just the last few weeks they're paying attention. And I can give you a list of parties all over the world where the international community is not ready to pay attention. So I believe that if you have a situation or if you have a confrontation where the international community, due to the limelight of media, pay attention, already their situation is less desperate than the situation of a conflict where nobody pay attention. This is what I was trying to explain to them. I was misunderstood, I recognize, and maybe it was a mistake.
Here.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Boutros-Ghali. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. My name is Elisheva Lambert. I'm a student at the college also. I came here tonight after going to Hillel, which is the Jewish organization on campus, where they were holding a memorial service honoring the assassination just about 1 year ago of Yitzhak Rabin. And I know probably everyone, hopefully everyone here is aware of that. It's been such a huge setback in the Middle East peace talks. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the reaction in the international community that you got to see firsthand in the UN, and what you think this terrible tragedy will do, if anything, in order to bring about faster resolution of terrorism, anti-terrorism resolutions.
I have personal relation with Rabin. We have negotiated together for many years, and he was a great man, and he was a great leader. And he had the courage to promote peace with the Palestinian and to begin a dialogue with the Palestinian. And again, this proves that the importance of terrorism. It was a terrorist who killed him. It was somebody who don't believe in dialogue, and somebody who was not in favor of a peaceful solution of this conflict. This is what I can say. And I can say that this have in a certain way postponed the peaceful solution of the Middle East crisis. We need more patience, more political imagination, and more time to find a solution. We were on the point to reach the solution, and then the accident happened, again due to a terrorist attack. And this has postponed the solution, and let us hope that we will be able to find a new approach, or we will to find a new way to solve this new crisis.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Eric Christopherson. I'm a junior at Harvard College, and my question concerns the situation in Northern Ireland. A couple years ago, when President Clinton issued his visa to Gerry Adams, many argued, not the least of which was England, that this was a major setback because, of course, they argued that the Sinn Féin is inextricably linked with the IRA. While many others argued that, in fact, because the Sinn Féin is technically a politically legitimate organization, that in fact it advanced the cause against terrorism. And I was wondering whether you think that Clinton's issuance of this visa was a setback or a step forward.
Happily for me, the United Nations is not involved in the problem of Ireland. So I have no comment on your question.
This lady here, please.
Good evening, Dr. Butrascali. Today, the presence of millions of landmines in the former Yugoslavia is one of the primary impediments to the reconstruction of that region. Some could make the argument that, in fact, the United Nations contributed to the problems they're having today by banning the import of landmine detectors during the war. Could you please comment on your thoughts on the banning of landmine detectors and whether or not you would lobby in the future to ensure that landmine detectors could be imported during times of war?
You are talking of one of my personal failures. I have tried in 3 international conferences to obtain the eradication of personal landmines without success, but we have to continue, and we will continue, because we have millions of mines all over the world. I visited in Cambodia a camp where they have training people to do the demining. To give you a figure, the price of a mine, a plastic mine, is around $2. To demine this, it depends if you have a map or not, it will cost between $20 to $30. And very often the same corporation are doing the mine and are doing the demining. So it is a real terrible problem, and you can see children and peasants, and another dimension of the problem, that once the peace had been concluded, you have a whole region where nobody, without access, because they are full of mines. And what is worse, that very often the local population, to protect themselves against bandits, bring mines and put mines again. So unless we will be able to have a total eradication of mine, and we have a conference which was held a few weeks ago in Canada, this will continue, and it will take years and decades and millions of dollars to demining all the place all over the world. We still have in my country mine of the World War II in the deserts between Libya and Egypt. So it is a real problem, and I will say that we have paid special attention to the CTBT, the non-proliferation of atomic arms, and we have not paid enough attention to the conventional arms, which I call mini disarmament. And we have been successful in obtaining the support of certain governments, or by buying arms from the former combatants, or by burning arms, but we have not been successful in the problem of demining.
But I still don't understand why landmine detectors were banned during the former Yugoslavia's war, such that the people couldn't demine their own fields or roads.
No, I'm not understanding the question.
Under the UN arms embargo, during the war in the former Yugoslavia, landmine detectors were included in the arms which could not be imported into the former Yugoslavia, and I don't understand why.
I don't know, because when we have included, you say that demining detector have been...
Exactly. The landmine detectors were included in the ban.
Maybe this was given to the Blue Helmet only, the official Blue Helmet, to do the operation.
Exactly, and then there are reports from the Blue Helmets that because the areas, the regions were controlled by the local armies, that after the UN Blue Helmets risked their lives to demine the areas, they then had to give the mines back to the controlling armies, who then turned around and planted the arms again, or planted the mines again.
I will be very frank, I'm not aware of all those details. Okay. But I will inquire and I will just give you an answer.
Okay, I'll certainly give you all of the documentation I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, the last question come to the balcony, please.
Good evening, Secretary General Ghali. It's a great privilege to speak to you. My name is Chris Van Japper. I'm a freshman here at Harvard. And one of the most known parts of the UNESCO Constitution is that in the minds of men is where wars are started. So it's in the minds of men that the constructs of peace must also be constructed. So my question is that this seems to also relate to terrorism, that to prevent terrorism, we must also look at education and social reform. However, UNESCO has become very ineffectual as the United States is no longer part of that organization. Do you think that the Constitution of UNESCO should be changed to give the United States a preponderant role, at least to get it involved in UNESCO, so that UNESCO can begin to address the problem of terrorism, address the problem of the social issues in this world, and to make this world a better place in the future?
Yeah, the last question is a very important one. Because what are the sources of terrorism? And I believe that we have many sources. One, it is the poverty. Very often in certain part of the world, a group of the population feels so marginalized that the only way to express their frustration is to use terrorism to achieve their goals. In other cases, you have a kind of religious fundamentalism. They decided that to return to the basic law of religion will save themselves. And you have another problem which is new. The average citizen feels insecure confronted by the globalization. So he returned back to his village, to his family, to his ethnic group. And then he feels that he don't belong anymore to the nation. And he feels again marginalized. This adds a new marginalization to the already existing marginalization. And one of the ways to be known is to use terrorist attack to be known. So those are few explanations of what are the sources of terrorism. And there is a new event, and this is what I was trying to present in this presentation or in this small talk, was that what is new is the global dimension. That terrorism before was limited to one country, was limited to one region. But now, because of the globalization in the communication, terrorists have an international network. So that we will not be able we will not be able to contain international terrorism unless we will have a global action. And the purpose of this expose was to try to explain that there is an international dimension to terrorism and it needs an international answer, a global answer. But as you mentioned, what are the sources, what are the causes of terrorism? This is change from each country to from each different ethnic group. It changes according to different, there are many reasons to this.
Thank you. You'll see that there's people with people here with questions all night long. I think that the Secretary General may have gotten some indication of the degree of enthusiasm and interest in his work and admiration for his work in terms of the number of questions where, unfortunately, he's got to go back to New York, and so we have to close now. But we hope he'll return for the continuation of this conversation sometime at his convenience. So thank you very much.